I was never the kind of guy to check my wife's phone. Never needed to. Sarah and I had been together for 12 years, married for 10, and in all that time, I never had a reason to doubt her. We had the kind of marriage people envied, or so I thought. It started with something small. One night, she laughed at a text message while we were watching a movie. I glanced over, expecting to see a message from her sister or one of her friends, but she tilted the screen away, just slightly. Barely noticeable, but enough for my gut to register that something was off. That was the first drop of poison in my brain. The next few days, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then the late nights started. Sarah, who always hated going out on weeknights, suddenly had work drinks with her coworkers twice in 1 week. Then 3 times. Then 4. Just unwinding. She'd say, kissing my cheek as she left. "You know how stressful work has been." And yeah, I knew. She worked in marketing, and their company was going through some merger, which meant late meetings and extra projects. But still, something didn't add up. Then came the perfume. Sarah wasn't the type to change her perfume often. She had this floral scent she'd worn since we were dating. But one evening, when she came home, she smelled different, like vanilla and musk, something deeper, richer. When I asked about it, she shrugged and said a coworker let her try a new fragrance. But she didn't just try it. She was wearing it. For someone else. That night, lying in bed next to her, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Something wasn't right. The final straw came when I noticed the gas receipts. I was doing some paperwork and found 2 crumpled receipts in the kitchen drawer, both from the same gas station, but on nights she was supposedly out at a bar across town. I couldn't ignore it anymore. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I followed her. The next night, Sarah told me she was heading out for another work event. I played it cool, gave her a casual kiss goodbye, then waited exactly 5 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. My heart pounded as I tailed her car, keeping 2 cars behind. I expected her to turn toward downtown, toward the bars and restaurants she claimed to be at. Instead, she drove across town, past the commercial district, into a quiet suburban neighborhood. She pulled into a driveway, parked, walked up to a house, rang the doorbell. A man answered. Tall, built, younger than me. He grinned, leaned in, and kissed my wife like he'd done it 1,000 times before. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My pulse roared in my ears. I had my proof. And now, I had a decision to make. I sat in my car for what felt like an eternity, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands started to ache. The man at the door wasn't just some casual fling. That much was clear from the way Sarah leaned into him, the way her body language screamed familiarity. He pulled her inside without hesitation, and the door closed behind them. I didn't need to see any more. The weight of reality pressed down on me, and for the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to be betrayed by someone you trusted completely. Driving home was a blur. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my mind was anything but. I could feel the anger simmering just beneath the surface, but it was held back by a strange sense of calm, as if my brain refused to process the situation completely. I needed to think, needed to be smart about this. Bursting in there, confronting her on the spot, that would have been satisfying, but it wouldn't get me what I needed. I wanted the full truth, not just this one moment. This wasn't about rage or revenge, not yet. This was about control. By the time Sarah came home, I was sitting on the couch, acting as if I had been half asleep watching TV. She walked in, kicked off her heels, and let out a tired sigh, as if she had actually been at some work event. The sheer audacity of it made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to keep my voice even. How was the event? She hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. She looked at me, forcing a casual smile. It was fine, just the usual. Boring, honestly. I nodded as if I believed her, as if I hadn't just watched her walk into another man's house a few hours ago. Glad you're home. She leaned down and kissed my cheek. It took everything in me not to recoil. The next morning, I called in sick to work. If Sarah was cheating, then this wasn't just a one-time thing. I needed more than a single piece of evidence, more than just what I had seen with my own eyes. I spent the day gathering every bit of information I could. Her phone was always locked, but that didn't mean I couldn't look through other things. Credit card statements, car mileage, social media activity, every little detail that didn't add up started forming a pattern. There were charges at restaurants she had no reason to visit, receipts for purchases I had never seen in the house, unexplained gaps in her schedule that lined up too perfectly with when I was at work. I wasn't just dealing with an affair. I was dealing with a carefully constructed lie, a second life she had built right under my nose. When she left for work the next day, I took things a step further. If she was comfortable enough to see him at his house, then there was a good chance she had been careless elsewhere. I searched our bedroom, checking her nightstand, her dresser, even inside her closet. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but when I found it, I knew. A second phone. It was tucked away in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, hidden beneath a stack of old paperwork. The screen was locked, but I didn't need to unlock it to know exactly what it was for. I set it back exactly as I found it. If I was going to do this right, I couldn't tip her off. That night, Sarah acted like nothing was wrong, like she was the same wife she had always been. She asked about my day, made small talk about a TV show we used to watch together, even laughed at one of my jokes. I played along, but inside, something had shifted permanently. She wasn't my wife anymore, not really. She was someone else, a stranger wearing the face of the woman I had loved for over a decade. The worst part was that she thought she was getting away with it. I let it continue for another week, pretending I was none the wiser. Every time she left for one of her work events, I tracked her. She met him more than once, sometimes at his house, sometimes at a hotel. I recorded everything. I took pictures, saved locations, noted the times. The more I gathered, the less of a person she became in my eyes. Then, something happened that made everything worse. One night, Sarah came home late again, but this time, she didn't go straight to the bedroom. She sat down next to me on the couch, her face serious. "We need to talk." I turned to her, keeping my expression neutral. "About what?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I feel like we've been distant lately. I don't know. I feel like maybe we're in a rut." A rut? That's what she called it. I forced myself to nod. "Yeah, maybe." She reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. "I just don't want us to lose each other." The sheer hypocrisy of it made my stomach turn. I looked into her eyes, wondering if she even felt guilty, or if she was just trying to justify whatever was happening in her own twisted way. I squeezed her hand back, pretending to be reassured. Me neither. I didn't sleep that night. Sarah thought she had control of the situation. She thought she could lie to my face, betray me over and over, and still play the role of the caring wife. But she had no idea that I already knew everything. She had no idea that the life she thought she was balancing so well was about to come crashing down. I wasn't going to just expose her. I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of the betrayal she had put me through. I just had to decide how. I had everything I needed. Every lie, every meeting, every moment of betrayal was documented, stored, and ready to be used. But I wasn't rushing. This wasn't just about confronting Sarah. This was about taking control of how this played out. I wasn't going to be the clueless husband begging for answers. I was going to be the one making the decisions. The problem was, I didn't know what the right move was yet. The answer came from an unexpected place. I had taken a half-day off work under the excuse of a doctor's appointment. Instead of going home, I decided to sit in my car and think, parked outside a coffee shop a few blocks away from Sarah's office. That was when I saw him, the man she had been sneaking around with. He was standing outside the building, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the fact that I was watching him. He wasn't anything special, just some guy who looked a little younger than me, maybe in his early 30s. He had the kind of confidence that came with thinking he was getting away with something. He had no idea who I was. I wasn't thinking when I got out of the car. I just moved, walking straight up to him before my brain could tell me it was a bad idea. His eyes flicked up from his phone as I stopped in front of him, confusion spreading across his face. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice calm. "You got a minute?" He blinked, clearly caught off guard. Do I know you?" "You know my wife." That wiped the confusion off his face instantly. His posture changed, his body tensing slightly, like he was ready to bolt. I didn't let him. "I don't want to make a scene," I continued. "I'm not here to fight you. I just want to talk." He swallowed hard, glancing around as if looking for an escape. "Look, man, I don't know what you. Don't lie to me." He shut up immediately. I gestured toward the coffee shop behind him. "Let's sit down. 5 minutes. That's all I need." He hesitated, his eyes scanning me, probably trying to figure out if I was about to punch him in the face. I wasn't. Not yet. Finally, he nodded. "All right. 5 minutes." We sat at a small table near the window. He avoided eye contact at first, but I wasn't letting him off that easy. "How long?" I asked, keeping my voice level. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. A few months. How did it start? At work. We talked a lot. One thing led to another. I clenched my jaw, but didn't interrupt. He shifted in his seat. I didn't know she was married at first. That was a lie. He must have seen the disbelief on my face because he quickly backtracked. Okay, I knew. But she said things weren't good between you two. That it was basically over. That's funny, considering she's been coming home to me every night acting like nothing's wrong. He had the decency to look guilty. I didn't think it was serious. I mean, I figured it would end eventually. Yeah, I said, leaning forward. It's ending all right, but not the way she thinks. He frowned, shifting uncomfortably. Look, I'm not trying to cause problems. If I'd known. You knew? Silence. I let out a slow breath. You still seeing her? His hesitation told me everything. I nodded, leaning back in my chair. I thought so. He cleared his throat. What are you planning to do? That depends, I said, watching him carefully. What are you planning to do? He swallowed, looking genuinely nervous now. I don't want to be involved in this mess anymore. Good, I said. Because you're going to help me end it. His eyes widened slightly. What do you mean? You're going to cut her off? No explanations, no warnings. Just disappear. Don't text her, don't call her, don't meet her. Nothing. If she tries to contact you, you ignore it. He blinked. That's it. For now, I said. And in exchange, I don't tell your boss that you've been screwing a married coworker on company time. His face went pale. Shit. I tilted my head. I'm guessing that wouldn't look too great on your record. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his forehead. Fine. I'll do it. You better, I said, standing up. Because if you don't, you'll regret it. He didn't argue. I left him sitting there, staring at his coffee like it held the answers to his problems. It probably felt like a victory to him, like he got off easy. He didn't realize that he was just the first step. That night, I waited. Sarah came home late again, but this time, she looked different. Stressed. On edge. She barely spoke, checking her phone repeatedly, her fingers gripping it a little too tightly. I knew exactly what she was looking for. No messages. No calls. Her little fantasy world was starting to crack, and she had no idea why. I could have ended it right there. Could have confronted her, thrown everything in her face, watched her scramble for excuses. But I wasn't done yet. Sarah had built this lie piece by piece, carefully crafting a second life behind my back. Now, I was going to make sure every single part of it collapsed in the worst way possible. And the best part? She wouldn't even see it coming. The silence was eating at her. Sarah was never good at handling the unknown, and now that her little affair had suddenly vanished without warning, she was spiraling. I could see it in the way she kept checking her phone, in the way she stared at nothing for long periods, in the way she barely spoke to me unless I spoke first. She was waiting for a message, for some kind of sign that this wasn't over, and when nothing came, she started to break. 2 days passed before she cracked. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my laptop while pretending not to notice her pacing back and forth near the counter. She had her phone in her hand, gripping it tightly like it was the only thing keeping her sane. She let out a frustrated sigh and turned to me. Have you ever had someone just stop talking to you out of nowhere? I looked up at her, feigning mild confusion. What do you mean? She hesitated, clearly debating how much she should say. I mean, like if you were close to someone, and then they just disappeared, like they didn't exist anymore. I let the words hang in the air for a moment before shrugging. Not really. Most people don't just cut contact without a reason. Her grip on the phone tightened. Yeah, right. She turned away, biting her lip, her frustration barely contained. She was unraveling, and I wasn't going to stop it. I wanted her to feel the weight of it, to sit in the emptiness she had created for herself. But I wasn't done yet. She had spent months lying to me, betraying me, playing me for a fool, and now it was my turn. The next night, I made my move. I got home late, later than usual, and when I walked through the door, Sarah was sitting on the couch, staring at her phone, barely acknowledging me. I could see the thoughts running through her head, the paranoia, the overthinking, the way she was trying to figure out if she had been used and discarded. It was time to push her further. I set my keys down on the counter and casually pulled out my own phone, making sure she could see the screen. I scrolled through it for a moment, then let out a small chuckle. She glanced at me. What's funny? I smirked, shaking my head. Nothing. Just a friend from work sent me something. She narrowed her eyes slightly. Who? I pretended to hesitate, then shrugged. Just Emily. You don't know her. The second I said the name, I saw it. The tiny flicker of suspicion, the way her posture changed ever so slightly, the way her breathing slowed just enough for me to notice. She had no right to be jealous, not after what she had done, but cheaters never like the idea of being cheated on. Emily, she repeated, forcing a casual tone. You never mentioned her before. I shrugged again. She just started a few months ago. We've been talking a lot at work. Her fingers tightened around her phone. Talking about what? I let out a small laugh. Jesus, Sarah, it's nothing serious. We just get along. She tried to play it off, nodding slowly, but I knew exactly what was happening in her head. She was already picturing it, already imagining the possibility that I was doing exactly what she had been doing to me. She had no idea that Emily didn't even exist. Over the next few days, I played the role perfectly. I started texting more at home, keeping my phone screen angled just enough so she could see when I typed, but not enough to see what I was actually doing. I started going out for drinks with coworkers when I had never done that before. I made sure to be just distracted enough when she spoke to me, just distant enough for her to feel it. By the end of the week, she was losing it. She started asking questions she had no right to ask, subtly at first, then more directly. Are you seeing someone? She finally blurted out one night while we were having dinner. I looked up from my plate, feigning surprise. What? She swallowed hard. You've been acting weird lately. Different. I raised an eyebrow. I could say the same about you. She stiffened. What's that supposed to mean? I set my fork down, leaning back in my chair. I don't know, Sarah. You tell me. Her face paled, just for a second, just long enough for me to see the fear flash across her expression. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling to find the right words. I let the silence stretch between us before finally speaking again. If you have something to confess, now's the time. Her breathing quickened. She was on the edge, teetering between lies and the truth, but I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't ready to admit anything. Not yet. Instead, she stood up abruptly, pushing her chair back. I don't know what you're talking about. I chuckled under my breath. Of course you don't. She stormed out of the kitchen, her footsteps heavy against the floor. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty chair across from me, feeling nothing but satisfaction. I had her exactly where I wanted her. The next morning, I set the final part of my plan in motion. While Sarah was in the shower, I took her second phone from its hiding place and left it on the kitchen table, unlocked, open to the messages she had sent to him. Then I waited. She walked into the kitchen, towel wrapped around her hair, scrolling through her main phone, before her eyes landed on the second one sitting on the table. She froze. I watched as her face drained of color, as her fingers twitched slightly at her sides, as her breathing became uneven. She turned to look at me, her voice barely above a whisper. Where did you get that? I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You left it out. She swallowed hard. Don't bother. She stared at me, eyes wide, lips parted like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. I pushed away from the counter and walked past her, heading toward the bedroom. Before I left the kitchen, I said one last thing. I hope it was worth it. I didn't look back. Sarah stood frozen in the kitchen, the second phone still sitting there like a landmine she had accidentally stepped on. I didn't wait for her reaction, didn't give her the chance to scramble for an excuse. I left the room, went straight to our bedroom, and started packing a bag. I wasn't leaving for good, not yet, but I wanted her to see that this wasn't something we were going to sit down and talk through like a normal argument. There was no coming back from this, and she needed to understand that. I could hear her in the kitchen, breathing heavily, pacing back and forth, no doubt trying to piece together a way to minimize the damage. But there was nothing she could say that would erase what she had done. She finally appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale. Please, she started, her voice shaky. Let's talk. I didn't even look at her. Talk about what? You know what? She snapped, her frustration creeping through. I know you're upset, but can we just? I cut her off, zipping up my bag. I don't want to hear it, Sarah. She let out a sharp breath, her hands gripping the doorframe. You don't want to hear it, or you don't want to deal with it? That made me laugh, an actual laugh that felt completely out of place in the situation. I turned to face her, finally meeting her eyes. You think I don't want to deal with this? I've been dealing with this for weeks, Sarah. While you were sneaking around, I was the one dealing with the reality of it. I've had to sit in this house, sleep next to you, knowing exactly what you were doing behind my back. And now that you finally got caught, now you want to talk." She flinched at my words, but quickly recovered. "I wasn't thinking straight," she said, her voice softer now. "I got caught up in something stupid, and I didn't know how to stop." "That's bullshit," I shot back. "You knew exactly what you were doing. Every single time you left this house, every lie you told, every excuse you made, you knew." She opened her mouth to argue but stopped, her shoulders sagging as if she finally realized that there was no defense for what she had done. She stepped into the room, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you still love me?" That question hit differently. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I had spent so many nights lying awake trying to figure it out myself. I used to love her. I used to think we had something solid, something worth fighting for. But now all I saw when I looked at her was betrayal. I shook my head. "I don't know." She closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the weight of my words. "I don't want to lose you," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "Should have thought about that before," I said, slinging the bag over my shoulder. "Where are you going?" she asked, panic creeping into her tone. "Somewhere that isn't here." She took a step forward, her hands reaching out, but she hesitated before touching me. "Please don't do this like this. Let's go to therapy, let's figure this out." "You want therapy now?" I asked, shaking my head in disbelief. "You didn't need therapy when you were lying to my face every day, but now that it's convenient, now you want to fix things?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let her manipulate the situation, wasn't going to let her make me feel guilty for her mistakes. She had months to fix things, months to stop, months to come clean. Instead, she chose to keep going until she got caught. That wasn't regret, that was damage control. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "But you did," I replied simply. She wiped at her face, frustration mixing with her sadness. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't want you to say anything," I told her. "I want you to sit with this. I want you to really feel what it's like to be left in the dark, to wonder what the other person is thinking, to be completely powerless." Because I was never the kind of guy to check my wife's phone. Never needed to. Sarah and I had been together for 12 years, married for 10, and in all that time, I never had a reason to doubt her. We had the kind of marriage people envied, or so I thought. It started with something small. One night, she laughed at a text message while we were watching a movie. I glanced over, expecting to see a message from her sister or one of her friends, but she tilted the screen away, just slightly. Barely noticeable, but enough for my gut to register that something was off. That was the first drop of poison in my brain. The next few days, I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then the late nights started. Sarah, who always hated going out on weeknights, suddenly had work drinks with her co-workers twice in 1 week. Then 3